Okay, so let's say you're a philosopher, right?
Hmm.
And you're super interested in how feminist ideas, get worked into philosophy. Well, perfect. Because this deep dive, it's all about analytic feminism.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah, it's basically how those really sharp, those argument-loving philosophers, how they approach feminist issues.
I like it.
You might be thinking, wait, can you really love logic and be a feminist?
Yeah.
Good question.
Yeah.
So let's dive in and find out.
Yeah, what's really fascinating is that analytic feminism, it isn't like a fixed set of rules or anything.
Right.
It's more like almost like a family resemblance, a
Mm,
shared kind of outlook,
got it. Okay, so we're not talking about a specific philosophical
Yeah.
school like, with a single founder or like a manifesto or something.
Yeah, exactly. It's
Uh-huh.
more like a group of philosophers who share certain, I guess you could say, core commitments.
Okay.
They really believe in like using the tools of analytic philosophy, clear arguments, you know, precise definitions, all that good stuff. Yeah, rigorous logic to analyze and challenge feminist issues.
Okay, I see. So they're taking those tools that analytic philosophy is known for and kind of applying them to concepts like gender, equality, power, all that.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And they really try to bring that analytic rigor, that real sharpness to bear on some pretty big ideas, like
Yeah.
truth, justice, objectivity, but all with a feminist lens.
Now that brings up a question. I bet a lot of our listeners are thinking this too.
Hmm.
Don't a lot of feminists actually critique those traditional philosophical concepts?
Hmm.
I mean, they might even see them as part of the problem, not the solution, right?
That's a really crucial point, and you're absolutely right. Many feminists, DO, reject those traditional ideas.
Right.
But analytic feminists, they offer kind of a different take.
Okay.
They argue that those core concepts, they actually are valuable. They could even be empowering. But once you kind of strip away the male bias, that's often been attached to them.
I see. So it's not like you're, throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Right.
It's more like, hey, these concepts, yeah, they've been misused, they've been misinterpreted in ways that have hurt women,
Yeah.
but they do have potential if we reclaim them.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like reclaiming powerful tools that have been misused in the past.
Right.
And that's where that analytic approach is so important. By carefully, dissecting these concepts, they
Yeah.
can really pinpoint those biases and kind of dismantle them.
Okay, so we've got the what. What about the how? Like, how do analytic feminists actually DO philosophy?
Mm.
What makes their approach unique?
I think one thing that really makes analytic feminists stand out is their real commitment to bridge building. Like, they're not afraid to engage with, traditional philosophers
Right.
or even other kinds of feminists, even like scientists.
Wow.
They see value in getting all these different perspectives and they try to find common ground.
That's so interesting. As a philosopher yourself, you can really appreciate that, I bet.
Oh, absolutely. And, their dedication to clear, rigorous argumentation, that really helps with that bridge building.
It makes sense. Yeah.
It makes their work accessible to, a wider audience.
Right, because that clarity is definitely something analytic philosophy is known for. Sometimes it feels like you need a decoder ring to understand some of this stuff.
Oh, yeah?
But analytic feminists, they really seem to, like, prioritize making those arguments understandable, even for people who aren't, like, deep in the field.
Exactly.
Right.
That clarity is a real strength of analytic feminism. Now, I think we should talk about the elephant in the room. There are some, pretty significant critiques of analytic philosophy out there.
Right, and I would imagine some of those critiques are particularly strong when we're talking about feminism.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
For example, there's this critique that, analytic philosophy can be too abstract,
Right.
Too focused on the ideal knower instead of, like, the messy reality of lived experience. It's that whole armchair philosophy thing.
Oh, yeah, I've definitely heard that one. And it does seem especially problematic, when we're talking about power and inequality and social justice.
Right.
These are things that are so deeply rooted in people's lives.
Exactly. You can't just sit around and theorize about oppression from, some detached viewpoint. You have to really get in there and look at how it actually affects people. And then there's the whole value-free objectivity thing, which, a lot of feminists find really problematic.
Yeah, that view from nowhere idea,
Mhm.
that a philosopher can somehow, like, detach themselves from their own biases and just, poof, have this perfectly neutral perspective.
Right. A lot of feminists would say that kind of objectivity is, well, first of all, it's impossible.
Right.
But it's also harmful because it just ignores how our social positions shape our understanding of the world.
Right. Totally.
Like, if you're claiming to have a neutral, objective viewpoint, you risk silencing all those voices of people who don't share that same, privileged position.
So how do analytic feminists respond to these kinds of critiques? Do they just dismiss them?
Not at all. They engage with them, like head on. One thing they might say is that those critiques, maybe they applied more to like older forms of analytic philosophy.
Okay.
But the field, it's evolved.
Right.
It's not your philosophy professor's analytic philosophy anymore.
I like that. Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So they highlight all these newer developments, like naturalized epistemology,
Okay.
which is much more aware of how social context shapes, how we know what we know.
Right. Naturalized epistemology is let's look at how people actually learn things in the real world.
Yeah, exactly.
Not just in some idealized thought experiment.
It acknowledges that our minds, they aren't these isolated things. They're shaped by our interactions, by the world, by other people, by social structures.
So it's a much more grounded approach.
Yeah.
Less abstract.
Absolutely. And that makes it much more compatible with, a lot of these feminist concerns.
I see. That's really fascinating. Now, another thing that I think is really interesting about analytic feminists is that they're willing to engage with work that they might not totally agree with.
That's a great point. They don't just toss out ideas, just because they come from a different philosophical tradition.
Yeah, it's almost like an intellectual humility.
Yeah.
They're willing to say, okay, maybe I don't agree with this person's whole argument,
Right.
but there might be some really valuable insights here.
Right. Yeah.
I can still learn something.
Exactly. They're really good at dissecting arguments and finding those kernels of truth,
Right.
even in work that they might, ultimately reject. And I think that's a skill for any philosopher, really.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. But I'm guessing even analytic feminism has, some blind spots.
Mm-hmm.
What doesn't it quite capture? Where does it fall short?
Well, I think one area where analytic feminism maybe struggles a little bit, as we talked about earlier, is with the concept of subjectivity.
Yeah.
It's that kind of messy, personal, realm of individual experience that can be hard to, capture in these neat and logical arguments.
You're right. And other types of feminism, like standpoint theory or psychoanalytic feminism, put a lot of emphasis on subjectivity, right? They'd argue that, how we understand the world, it's really deeply shaped by our own, unique experiences and perspectives, right? Especially if we're members of marginalized groups.
Yeah, so those perspectives and those lived experiences, they become, valuable sources of knowledge, not something that you want to, eliminate in the pursuit of some, quote-unquote objective truth.
Exactly. But analytic feminism, with its focus on, logic and reason, it sometimes runs into trouble trying to incorporate those more subjective elements. It's almost like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole or something.
Right, exactly, like a category error. Trying to take the tools of logic and apply them to something that's, fundamentally about feelings and emotions and personal experiences.
Yeah, exactly.
And that can be a real limitation because, understanding subjectivity, it's so crucial for, really understanding how power works on a personal level.
Mm-hmm.
It helps us to see how our experiences, especially if we're members of marginalized groups, really shape how we see the world.
Right. So it's not enough to just, analyze these abstract concepts like justice or equality, right?
Right.
You got to look at how those things are experienced by real people in their daily lives.
Absolutely. And that's where I think other feminist approaches, like standpoint theory, can really complement analytic feminism.
Oh, that's interesting. Can you say a little bit more about standpoint theory, how it connects to this idea of subjectivity?
Sure. So standpoint theory really emphasizes the unique perspectives of people who have been, marginalized or oppressed.
Okay.
It argues that these folks, they often have a deeper understanding of how power works, because they've experienced its negative effects firsthand.
So it's not just about saying, hey, everybody has their own perspective.
Right.
It's saying that some perspectives are just more insightful, more revealing than others, precisely because they're based on, these experiences of people who've been systematically excluded or silenced.
Exactly. And standpoint theory really challenges that idea that there's just one objective truth out there,
Right.
That everyone can access in the same way. It says, look, where you stand in society, your social position, it shapes what you can see, what you can understand.
I see, yeah. Okay, so let's bring it back to analytic feminism for a minute. We've talked about, what it is, how it works, its strengths, its limitations. But I guess I'm curious about the so what
Yeah.
question. Like, why should all this matter to a philosopher, you know?
That's a great question. For philosophers, I think analytic feminism just offers this really valuable set of tools for thinking about tough issues.
Mm-hmm.
It encourages us to be precise with our language,
Yeah.
to really try to identify those hidden assumptions
Right.
and to construct, strong, well-supported arguments.
So those analytic skills, they're transferable. You can use them in other areas of philosophy, too.
Absolutely. But even more than that, I think analytic feminism reminds us that philosophy, it's not just, this abstract thing,
Right.
some ivory tower pursuit. It has real implications in the world.
Yeah, it's about engaging with the world,
Yeah.
using those philosophical tools to understand and hopefully to address real problems like inequality and injustice.
Exactly. Analytic feminism pushes us to bridge that gap,
Yeah, right.
between theory and practice, to use those philosophical insights to really make a difference, for women and for other marginalized groups.
Now, we've touched on this before, but I think it's worth repeating. No single philosophical approach is going to fully capture, the full scope and complexity of feminist thought, right?
You're absolutely right. Analytic feminism has its strengths, but it's got its limitations too. And it's important to, be aware of those, to be open to other perspectives, to recognize that we need a diversity of approaches to really get the full picture.
It's like, you've got a toolbox, right?
Right.
You wouldn't try to fix everything with just a hammer.
Exactly. We need a variety of tools, a range of approaches if we want to really grasp and to address just the multifaceted nature of feminism.
Absolutely. So, for all the philosophers out there listening, what would you say are the key takeaways from this deep dive into analytic feminism?
Well, first I'd say appreciate the rigor. Embrace the power of clear, precise language. Don't be afraid to really get into the weeds of an argument,
Hmm.
to break it down into its component parts. That kind of analysis can be incredibly insightful and revealing.
Yeah, really hone those analytic skills.
Exactly. Second, remember to build bridges. Talk to people from different philosophical backgrounds, with different perspectives, even people you disagree with. You might be surprised by what you learn.
It's about expanding your horizons.
Absolutely. And finally, don't be afraid to really grapple with, that messy, complicated reality of lived experience.
Yeah.
Don't get so caught up in those abstract concepts that you lose sight of the real people whose lives are actually affected by these cues.
So bring that philosophical rigor to bear on the problems that matter most.
Right.
Make a difference in the world.
Beautifully said. And as you do that work, remember the words of Audre Lorde.
Hmm.
The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So, be mindful of the limitations of any single approach.
Yeah.
Be willing to challenge assumptions. Be open to new ways of thinking.
Analytic feminism is such a powerful tool for change, but it's just one part of a much larger and more vibrant feminist movement.
Absolutely.
So use it wisely,
Yeah.
use it thoughtfully, and use it to create a more just and a more equitable future for all.
Well said. And as we wrap up our deep dive into analytic feminism, I'd like to leave you with one final thought. How can we ensure that philosophy, in all its forms, stays relevant? That it's engaged with the pressing issues of our time. How can we avoid retreating into that ivory tower and actually use our philosophical skills to make a positive impact on the world?
Those are great questions. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into analytic feminism. We hope you enjoyed it.